Good evening and welcome, sweet viewer. Wherever you are in the world, whatever the hour on your clock, find a quiet moment. Settle in. The world outside, with its electric lights and digital hum, can wait. We are about to journey back to a time of storm and steel, to an age when the world seemed to be ending, delivered from the cold grey sea. Perhaps leave a comment of the time and place you are listening from, a small marker in the present, before we go back to witness the birth of a fear so profound it would be carved into the prayers of a continent. There is a plea, an appeal to the divine that echoed in the stone churches and wooden chapels of coastal Europe for 300 years. It was not a prayer for bountiful harvest, nor for a king's health, nor for the souls of the departed. It was a prayer born of pure, distilled terror, a desperate litany whispered in the flickering candlelight as the wind howled outside with the promise of more than just a storm. A furore normanorum libera nos, Domine, from the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us. To understand why these three words became the anthem of an age, why the very name Viking became a synonym for fire, blood, and ruin, we must look past the modern caricatures of horned helmets and ale-swilling brutes. The truth is far more complex and far more terrifying. The fear they inspired was not merely of a strong man with a heavy axe. It was a systemic, psychological, and spiritual horror. It was the fear of a phenomenon that broke the known world, a force that came from the grey void of the sea, a place of myth and monsters, and obeyed no rules but its own. To find the beginning of this fear, its ground zero, we must travel to a quiet, tidal island, a windswept sanctuary of grass and sacred stone tethered to the northeastern coast of England. Lindisfarne. In the year of our Lord 793, it was known simply as the Holy Island, and it was arguably the most sacred site in all of Anglo-Saxon England, perhaps in all of Christendom. Founded by the Irish monk St. Aidan, it had become a radiant centre of learning, faith, and art. It was home to the precious relics of St. Cuthbert, a bishop and hermit whose posthumous miracles drew pilgrims from across the kingdom. Within the walls of its priory, generations of monks had dedicated their lives to the glory of God, performing the sacred labour of the scriptorium. Here, with ink made from soot and oak galls and pigments ground from rare minerals and plants, they had painstakingly illuminated the Word of God onto hundreds of sheets of delicate calfskin vellum, creating masterpieces of insular art like the Lindisfarne Gospels. Their world was one of impeccable, sacred order. It was a world of prayer and tolling bells, of a predictable, cyclical rhythm governed by the rising and setting of the sun and the immutable progression of the liturgical calendar. Their conception of warfare was grounded in the world they knew, the formalized clash of Christian kings on defined battlefields, struggles for land and legitimacy fought between men who, for all their violence, shared a common cultural and religious framework. An army marched overland, its coming announced by scouts and rumors. A sanctuary, a house of God, was a place of inviolable peace, a space outside the normal rules of conflict. These were the fundamental pillars of their reality. And on a summer's day, the 8th of June, all of those pillars were about to be pulverized into dust. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a remarkable set of annals kept by monks to record the history of their people, describes the portents that preceded the event with a palpable sense of cosmic dread. In the skies over Northumbria, there were immense whirlwinds, terrifying flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. To a modern mind, this is meteorological phenomenon filtered through folklore. To the mind of an 8th century monk, it was a terrifying sign that the covenant between God and humanity was fracturing. It was a divine warning that the very fabric of nature was coming undone. Then, the warning took physical form. From the grey, featureless expanse of the North Sea, they appeared. They were not a fleet in any recognizable English or Frankish sense. They were long, slender, almost impossibly elegant ships, each with a single massive square sail, perhaps dyed red with madder or striped in bold colours to strike fear into those who saw them. They seemed to possess a life of their own, their high, curving prows and sterns giving them the appearance of great sea serpents. At the prow of each vessel reared a dragon's head, intricately carved from wood and painted in garish colours, its mouth agape in a silent, eternal scream, its eyes glaring with menace. These ships, the langskips, moved with an unnatural speed and grace, their flexible, clinker-built hulls allowing them to ride over the waves like a seabird rather than ploughing ponderously through them. They did not need a deep harbour or a prepared dock. Their hulls were engineered with a shallow draft, a revolutionary design feature that was a key to their terror. They simply drove their ships directly onto the sacred, sandy beaches of the island, their keels grinding on the shore with a sound that signalled the end of an era. Before the monks of Lindisfarne could fully comprehend what was happening, the nightmare had landed. From the bellies of these sea drakes poured not a disciplined marching army, but a tide of men who seemed a part of the storm itself. They were large, many with long braided hair and beards, their eyes, as one chronicler would later write, wild with a fervour the monks had never witnessed. They wore practical, rugged clothing of wool and leather, but they were armed with a terrifying efficiency. They moved with a speed and purpose that was utterly alien. There were no formations, no battle lines, no heralds announcing their intent. They were a living wave of violence that crashed upon the monastery, a place that had known only peace for over a century. The sounds that followed, the splintering of the priory's ancient wooden doors, the shattering of stained glass, the high-pitched screams of terror and pain, the guttural war cries in an unknown, harsh tongue, would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives and echo in the letters and chronicles of the age. The Vikings fell upon the inhabitants with a savagery that defied Christian understanding. The monks, men of God, were non-combatants, protected by a sacred taboo that had governed European warfare for centuries. To the Northmen, this concept was meaningless. They saw not holy men, but easy targets. They slew some of the monks, one account states with chilling simplicity. They were cut down with axes and swords where they stood, their blood spattering the very altars they served. But death was not the worst fate. Many others, particularly the young and the skilled, were seized, bound with ropes and treated like livestock. They were stripped naked, a profound act of humiliation, and herded towards the ships to be sold into slavery, a life of endless toil in a strange and heathen land. The Vikings called them thralls, and they were a primary source of the wealth that drove the Viking expansion. Then came the desecration. This, more than the killing and the kidnapping, was what sent a shockwave of spiritual horror across the Christian world. The raiders stormed into the church not with reverence, but with a predatory hunger for its treasures. They saw not a house of God, but a repository of wealth. They hacked at the high altar, adorned with silver and gold, prying off the precious metals. They seized the communion chalices, the golden candlesticks, the silken altar cloths. They broke open the reliquaries, the jewel-encrusted chests that held the sacred bones of St. Cuthbert, and scattered the holy relics on the floor, contemptuous of their spiritual power. They found the monastery's greatest treasures, the illuminated manuscripts like the Lindisfarne Gospels. They did not value the centuries of faith and artistry contained within the pages. They valued the covers, which were often lavishly decorated with gold, silver, and precious gems. They ripped the books apart, tearing off the bindings and casting the sacred painted pages into the mud and the sea. The image of God's holy word, a work of profound beauty and devotion, being trampled underfoot by laughing, blood-soaked pagans was an act of blasphemy so profound it was almost unimaginable. They took everything of portable value, loaded their captives and their loot onto their dragon ships, and then, as quickly and mysteriously as they had arrived, they pushed off from the beach and vanished back into the grey sea, leaving behind a scene of smouldering ruins, mutilated corpses, and shattered faith. The news of the raid on Lindisfarne spread like a plague. Alcuin of York, a Northumbrian scholar at the court of the great Frankish emperor Charlemagne, received the news and was plunged into despair. His letters, which survive to this day, are a testament to the psychological impact of the event. He wrote to the Bishop of Lindisfarne, "Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God like dung in the streets." For Alcuin and his contemporaries, this was not a simple military defeat. It was a theological crisis. How could a merciful and all-powerful God allow his most holy sanctuary to be so brutally defiled? Had God abandoned them? Were these Northmen a divine punishment for the sins of the English people? Or were they something worse, something from outside God's creation, demons in human form? This event at Lindisfarne in 793 was the Vikings' brutal announcement to the world. It established the terrifying blueprint for the next 3 centuries: lightning-fast raids from the sea, a complete disregard for Christian sanctuaries and rules of war, savage and efficient violence, and the primary goals of portable wealth and slaves. The fear was born not just of what they did, but of what they represented: chaos, godlessness, and a world turned upside down. To truly grasp the fear, one must understand the engine that powered it, the Viking ship. The langskip, in its various forms like the karvi, the snekja, and the great draka, was the single greatest technological and tactical advantage the Scandinavian peoples possessed. It was a masterpiece of naval engineering, a vessel perfectly evolved for its predatory purpose. Its construction, known as clinker building, involved overlapping oak planks that were fastened together with iron rivets. This technique created a hull that was both incredibly strong and remarkably flexible. Unlike the heavier, more rigid ships of the Mediterranean or the clumsy cogs of the Franks, a langskip did not fight the sea, it moved with it. It could bend and twist in heavy swells, absorbing the energy of the waves rather than being battered by it. This flexibility, combined with its long, narrow profile and a single large mast with a highly efficient square sail, made it exceptionally fast for its time, capable of covering over 100 miles in a single day under favorable conditions. Its most terrifying feature, however, was its shallow draft. A fully loaded langskip drew as little as 50 centimeters, or less than 2 feet, of water. The strategic implications of this were catastrophic for the peoples of Europe. It meant the Vikings were not confined to raiding established, fortified coastal ports. They could sail with impunity up shallow rivers and estuaries, penetrating deep into the heartlands of England, Francia, and beyond. Cities that had considered themselves safe, hundreds of miles from the open sea, places like York on the Ouse, London on the Thames, Nantes on the Loire, and even Paris on the Seine, were now vulnerable frontline targets. The langskip could navigate these waterways and then, just as easily, be beached on any gently sloping riverbank or sandy shore. There was no need for infrastructure. The Vikings could land their forces anywhere, at any time. This unpredictability was a weapon in itself. It created a state of constant, gnawing anxiety for any settlement within reach of a waterway. A farmer tilling his fields miles from the coast could look up and see the terrifying, dragon-headed prow of a langskip appearing over the riverbank. By the time he could raise an alarm, it would be too late. The raiders would be upon his village. This ability to appear as if from nowhere, strike with devastating force, and then vanish before a local lord or king could muster a defense was the core of their tactical supremacy and a primary source of the terror they inspired. Equally important was their navigational prowess. In an age when most European sailors were terrified of losing sight of land, the Vikings were masters of the open ocean. They navigated with a sophisticated understanding of the natural world. They used the sun as a primary guide, likely employing tools like a sun compass, a simple but effective device that used a gnomon's shadow on a marked disc to determine direction. On cloudy days, legend speaks of the solarstein, the sunstone. This is now believed to have been a piece of a polarizing crystal like cordierite, which when held up to the sky, could reveal the position of the sun even through heavy cloud cover by detecting the polarization of its light. Beyond these tools, they possessed a deep, instinctual knowledge of the sea passed down through generations. They could read the patterns of waves, the flight paths of migratory birds, the color of the water, and the presence of distant cloud formations to find their way. This confidence on the open water allowed them to pioneer new sea lanes and attack from unexpected directions. While Frankish defenders were watching the Channel coast, Viking fleets could be sailing across the North Sea to strike the English coast or rounding the Iberian Peninsula to raid in the Mediterranean. This mastery of the sea made them seem ubiquitous and inescapable, a phantom menace that could emerge from any point on the compass. And what of the men who crewed these ships? The Viking warrior was the product of a harsh environment and a harder culture. Scandinavia was a land of limited arable soil, long, dark winters, and a deeply ingrained warrior ethos. For many young men, the path to wealth, status, and fame was not through farming a small plot of land, but through the high-risk, high-reward enterprise of a Viking expedition. Their society was intensely hierarchical and competitive, and a man's worth was measured by his deeds, his courage, and his reputation. This concept of honor, or heder, was central to their worldview. A good reputation, earned through acts of bravery, generosity to one's followers, and victory in battle, was the most valuable thing a man could possess. It was an immortal legacy that would be celebrated in the skaldic poetry recited in the mead halls long after he was gone. Conversely, cowardice or dishonor brought a shame, need, that was a fate worse than death. This cultural imperative to seek honor was supercharged by their religious beliefs. The Norse cosmos was a grim, fatalistic place. The gods themselves, the Aesir, were not immortal in the Christian sense. They were doomed to be destroyed in a final, cataclysmic battle with the giants at Ragnarok. The fate of every man, his death day, was preordained by the Norns, three mystical women who wove the tapestry of destiny. Since one could not escape one's fate, the only thing a man could control was how he met it. To die bravely in battle was the highest possible honor. Those who did so were chosen by the Valkyries, the supernatural shield maidens of Odin, to be taken to Valhalla, the great hall of the slain in Asgard. There they would feast, fight, and drink every day, training and preparing to fight alongside Odin and the gods at Ragnarok. To die of sickness or old age in one's bed, a straw death, was considered shameful, and such souls were relegated to the cold, gloomy underworld of hell. This belief system produced warriors who were not merely willing to die, but actively sought a glorious death in combat. This fatalism, this eagerness for battle, was utterly terrifying to their Christian opponents, who fought for survival in this life and salvation in the next, and for whom death was a somber and feared transition. A Viking warrior, believing his fate was already sealed and a glorious afterlife awaited the brave, could fight with a reckless abandon and ferocity that seemed inhuman. The weapons they wielded were extensions of this brutal efficiency. While the sword, particularly the high-status, pattern-welded blades like the famous Ulfbert swords, was a sign of a wealthy leader, the quintessential weapon of the Viking Age was the axe. The Dane axe, with its long handle and massive crescent-shaped blade, was a weapon of terrifying power. Wielded with two hands, it could cleave through a shield, a helmet, and the man beneath with a single, devastating blow. It had reach, it had momentum, and in the hands of a strong Norseman, it was an instrument of sheer butchery. Smaller hand axes were also common, useful for throwing or for close-quarters fighting after the shield wall broke. The spear was ubiquitous, the primary weapon of the average warrior, used for thrusting and throwing. And every free man carried a seax, a long, single-edged knife that was both a utility tool and a weapon of last resort in the chaos of a melee. Their primary defense was the round shield, typically made of lindenwood and faced with leather, with a central iron boss to protect the hand. In battle, Vikings would often fight in a shield wall, the skjaldborg. They would lock their shields together, creating a solid barrier of wood and iron, with a hedge of spear points bristling over the top. It was a formidable defensive formation, difficult to break, but the Vikings were masters of both defense and offense. On a signal, the shield wall could dissolve into a furious, individualistic charge, with warriors seeking out opponents for single combat to win honor. It was in these moments of frenzied attack that the most feared, and perhaps most misunderstood, Viking warriors appeared, the berserkers. The berserker, or bear shirts, and their counterparts, the Ulfhedna, or wolfskins, were champions of Odin who were said to enter a state of ecstatic, uncontrollable rage in battle. The Norse sagas describe them biting the rims of their shields, howling like wild animals, and fighting with a superhuman strength, seemingly immune to pain from fire or steel. They would cast aside their own shields and armor and charge headlong into the enemy ranks, a terrifying sight that could break the morale of even seasoned troops. The psychological impact of facing a warrior who seemed to be a literal fusion of man and beast, who fought without any sense of self-preservation, cannot be overstated. Modern scholars debate the reality of the berserker rage. Was it a ritualistic trance induced by war dances and chants, the result of ingesting hallucinogenic mushrooms like Amanita muscaria? Or perhaps a form of self-induced hysteria, a kind of combat-related post-traumatic stress disorder manifested in the heat of battle? Whatever its source, the phenomenon was real enough to be recorded in numerous sagas and even in the law codes of the time, which eventually outlawed berserker behavior. They represented the untamed animalistic fury that lay at the heart of the Viking warrior ethos, a fury that was utterly alien and horrifying to their more civilized opponents. The fear of the Vikings was therefore a composite terror, a multi-layered nightmare. It was the fear of their ships, which could appear from nowhere and strike anywhere. It was the fear of their speed, which made organized defense nearly impossible. It was the fear of their savagery, their willingness to kill indiscriminately and desecrate the most sacred of places. It was the fear of their paganism, which placed them outside the moral universe of Christendom and made them seem like agents of the devil. And it was the fear of their fatalistic warrior culture, which produced men who fought with a joyous, terrifying abandon, seeking a glorious death that their victims prayed to avoid. They did not just raid villages, they raided the very sense of security and order upon which medieval society was built. They were the fury of the Northmen, and for 3 long centuries, no one knew when or where that fury would strike next. The fear, at first, was of the storm. A terrifying, violent squall that came without warning from a placid sea, wrecked the coastline, and then receded, leaving a stunned and bleeding world in its wake. For decades, this was the rhythm of the terror. The longships would appear with the favorable winds of spring and summer, the Viking season. They would raid, pillage, and murder, and then, as autumn painted the leaves gold and the seas grew treacherous, they would vanish, returning to their mysterious northern homelands. This seasonal nature, for all its horror, offered a reprieve. It allowed for a breath, a moment to rebuild, to pray, to hope that the next season might be different. But the nature of fear is to evolve, to metastasize. And in the middle of the 9th century, the fear changed. It ceased to be a storm and became the climate. The Northmen stopped leaving. The ghost that haunted the summers decided to stay for the winter, and in doing so, it transformed from a predatory raider into an occupying plague, and the fear it inspired became a permanent, grinding feature of existence. This terrifying new phase was given a name by the trembling chroniclers of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. They called it the Mikael Hayden Heer, the Great Heathen Army. This was not another raiding fleet. It was a coalition, a grand alliance of Viking warbands from across Scandinavia, united under a semi-legendary leadership that included the sons of the famous Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba. The sagas claim their invasion of England was an act of vengeance for the death of their father, supposedly executed by King Ella of Northumbria by being cast into a pit of vipers. The historical reality was likely more pragmatic, a desire for conquest, settlement, and plunder on a scale never before imagined. In the autumn of 865, this massive force, comprising hundreds of ships and thousands of warriors, did not raid and leave. It landed in the kingdom of East Anglia, and instead of plundering, it made camp. The Vikings seized horses from the local populace, transforming their sea-born warriors into a terrifyingly mobile land army, and demanded provisions. The local king, faced with overwhelming force, had no choice but to buy a temporary peace, providing them with the food and mounts they needed to survive the winter. The cancer was now in the body politic, and it was preparing to spread. With the spring of 866, the Great Heathen Army marched north into the Kingdom of Northumbria, a realm already weakened by a bitter civil war between 2 rival claimants to the throne, Osbert and Ella. The Vikings, masters of exploiting division, marched on the kingdom's capital, the great Roman-walled city of Eoforwic, York. They seized it with shocking ease. The warring Northumbrian kings, realizing their folly too late, forged a truce and attempted to retake their city. They managed to breach the walls, but in the narrow, chaotic streets, their forces were enveloped and annihilated by the more experienced Viking warriors. Both kings were slain. According to Norse sagas, King Ella, the supposed murderer of Ragnar, was subjected to a horrific ritual execution, a symbol of the new level of intimate cruelty the Vikings were prepared to inflict. The army had not just defeated a kingdom, it had decapitated it. They installed a puppet ruler, a compliant English nobleman named Ecgbert, to tax the surviving population on their behalf, and turned York into their own fortified capital, renaming it Jorvik. It would become the heart of a new Viking kingdom in England. From this secure base, the army turned its attention south. In 869, it marched back into East Anglia, but this time, it did not come for tribute. It came for conquest. The king of East Anglia was a man named Edmund. He was a devout Christian, known for his piety. He raised his army and fought the Vikings, but was defeated and captured. What happened next, as recorded by his hagiographer Abbo of Fleury a century later, became one of the most potent legends of the age, a story that perfectly encapsulated the clash between Christian martyrdom and pagan fury. According to the tale, the Viking leaders, Ivar and Ubba, demanded that Edmund renounce his faith and rule as their vassal under their pagan authority. Edmund, choosing his god over his life, refused. Enraged, the Vikings enacted a sadistic parody of Christ's suffering. They tied him to a tree. They whipped him with thorns. Then, they used him for target practice, loosing so many arrows into his body that the chronicler wrote he resembled a porcupine or a thistle. Yet through it all, he refused to renounce his faith, continuing to call upon the name of Jesus. Finally, growing bored with the sport, they beheaded him and, in a final act of contempt, threw his head into a thick, dark bramble patch so his followers could not give him a proper Christian burial. The legend concludes with his followers searching for the head, calling out, "Where are you, friend?" and the head miraculously crying out, "Here, here, here!" until they found it, guarded by a great grey wolf who had protected it from other beasts. Edmund was instantly revered as a saint and a martyr, a symbol of righteous defiance. But the story of his death also served as a terrifying piece of Viking propaganda. This is what happens to kings who resist us. We do not just kill you, we mock your faith and desecrate your body. It is in the context of this new, intimate brutality that we must confront one of the most debated and horrifying practices attributed to the Vikings, the ritual of the blood eagle. Mentioned in the poetic verses of the sagas and other Norse literature, it stands as the apex of calculated cruelty, a form of execution so elaborate and excruciating it seems to belong more to the realm of demonic fantasy than human history. The descriptions vary, but the procedure, in its most complete form, was this. The victim, typically a captured enemy of high status who had committed a grave offense against the executioner's family, would be forced to lie face down. The executioner would then use a blade to carve the shape of an eagle's wings into the victim's back, hacking the ribs away from the spine one by one and bending them outwards to create a pair of bloody, protruding wings. In the final unbearable step, the lungs would be pulled out through the openings in the back and laid over the wings. The fluttering of the dying man's lungs as he gasped his last breaths was said to resemble the gentle beating of an eagle's wings. The ritual was described as a sacrifice to the war god, Odin. The historicity of the blood eagle is a matter of intense scholarly debate. There is no contemporary, first-hand account of it ever being performed. The descriptions come from Norse sagas written down centuries after the Viking Age, often by Christian authors like Snorri Sturluson, who may have been embellishing or misinterpreting older, more obscure poetic kennings. Some historians argue that it was a literary invention, a piece of Christian propaganda designed to portray the Vikings as monstrously inhuman, or a boastful fiction created by the Norse themselves to enhance their terrifying reputation. Others suggest it may have been a real, if exceptionally rare, form of ritual human sacrifice, consistent with other evidence of sacrificial practices in pre-Christian Scandinavia. But in many ways, the academic debate is secondary to the power of the idea itself. Whether the blood eagle was a common practice or a mythic fiction, the story of it was a weapon. It was a tale whispered in horror in the monasteries of Francia and the halls of Anglo-Saxon England. It contributed to the image of the Viking as an enemy who operated on a different plane of existence, one for whom cruelty was not just a tool of war, but a form of religious and artistic expression. It was the ultimate psychological terror, the fear of a death so hideous it defied all civilized comprehension. As the great heathen army continued its inexorable grind, conquering kingdom after kingdom, another, more insidious form of terror began to emerge. The Vikings were not just warriors, they were astute, pragmatic businessmen. They quickly realized that the threat of violence could be as profitable as violence itself, and sometimes even more so. This realization gave birth to the Danegeld. The term literally means Dane tax or Dane tribute, and it represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between the Vikings and their victims. It was protection money, a national-scale extortion racket. The process was brutally simple. A Viking army would arrive, make a show of force, perhaps burn a few outlying villages, and then present the local king or ruler with a choice: face annihilation or pay them to leave. The first major Danegeld in England was paid by the Mercians in 868. King Alfred of Wessex, who would later become the Vikings' greatest adversary, paid his own in 878. The Franks had been paying such tributes for decades. These were not small sums. They were vast quantities of silver and gold, often numbering in the thousands of pounds. To raise this money, Anglo-Saxon kings had to levy crippling taxes on their people, confiscate land, and, most tellingly, melt down the sacred treasures of their own churches, the golden chalices, the silver crucifixes, the bejeweled book covers, to satisfy the greed of the pagans who had once stolen them. The Danegeld was a multi-layered weapon. Financially, it drained kingdoms of their wealth, making them progressively weaker and less able to fund their own defenses for the next time the Vikings returned. Militarily, it was a confession of weakness, an open admission that the king could not protect his own people. And psychologically, it was utterly devastating. It institutionalized fear, turning it into a line item on the national budget. It was a constant, humiliating reminder of who held the true power. And it was a fool's bargain. Paying the Danegeld only proved that a kingdom was both rich and weak, making it an even more attractive target for the next Viking army that arrived, demanding their own tribute. It was a cycle of extortion and appeasement that bled its victims white, a slow financial death that was just as destructive as a swift one by the axe. Underpinning all of this, the raids, the conquest, the Danegeld, was an economic foundation built on a commodity more precious than silver: human beings. The Viking slave trade was a vast, sophisticated, and horrifyingly brutal enterprise that stretched from the icy shores of Greenland to the bustling markets of Constantinople and Baghdad. The Old Norse word for a slave, thrall, appears constantly in their legal codes and literature. It was a defined social class, the absolute bottom of the Scandinavian social ladder. Thralls were property, with no rights, no legal standing, and no hope. They could be bought, sold, bred, beaten, or killed at their master's whim. The Vikings were not sentimental about where they acquired this human livestock. They enslaved their own Scandinavian rivals, defeated in battle. They enslaved the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe in such vast numbers that their ethnic name, Slav, became the root of the word slave in English and many other European languages. And they enslaved the peoples of Western Europe with a rapacious efficiency. The raid on a village or monastery was often a slave-gathering expedition. The Vikings were selective. They prized skilled artisans, blacksmiths, weavers, carpenters, and, above all, young women and boys. Women were valued for domestic labor, as concubines, and for their ability to produce more thralls. Boys were valued for farm work and their potential to be raised within the Norse world. During a raid, the old, the infirm, and the very young were often simply killed outright, as they were not worth the space they would take up in a longship. The able-bodied were bound, collared, and marched back to the ships to begin a journey into a living hell. The psychological trauma of this process is impossible to fully comprehend. Imagine a young girl from an English village seeing her parents cut down, her home burned, then being tied to a line of other sobbing captives, prodded onto a strange ship, and taken across the sea to a cold, dark land where she understood not a word, her name and identity erased, her future a terrifying blank slate of servitude. This was not a cottage industry, it was a cornerstone of the Viking economy. Great slave markets flourished in Viking centres like Hedeby in Denmark and, most notoriously, in Dublin, which the Vikings founded as a fortified port. From Dublin, a massive trade in Irish slaves, known to the Arabs as Irlandiyun, was conducted. These captives would be shipped across the sea to Viking territories in England, to Scandinavia, and from there, along the great river routes of Russia, the Volga trade route, down to the Caspian Sea and the markets of the vast Abbasid Caliphate. There, European thralls with their fair skin and hair were considered exotic luxuries and fetched enormous prices, traded for the dirhams, the silver coins of the Islamic world that have been found in the thousands in Viking hordes all across Scandinavia. This global network of human trafficking was cold, calculated, and ruthlessly efficient. It reveals a side of the Vikings that is perhaps more chilling than the berserker's rage. It was not hot-blooded fury. It was the cold-blooded logic of commerce. The fear of the Vikings was not just the fear of a warrior's axe in the heat of battle. It was the quiet, gnawing, existential dread that your entire life, your family, your community could be utterly erased, not out of rage or hatred, but simply because you had become a commodity on the international market. The fury of the Northmen had evolved. It was now a system, an enterprise, and its business was fear. The fear was not monolithic. It had a different texture, a different flavor, depending on where you lived. For a peasant in the English Danelaw, it became the grim resignation of living under a new master, paying taxes to a Norse jarl, and seeing the faces of the conquerors every day in the marketplace. For a Frankish noble, it was the chronic anxiety of a coastline that could never be fully secured, a game of strategic whack-a-mole against an enemy who refused to play by the rules of conventional warfare. But to understand the sheer continental scale of the Vikings' ambition and the unique brand of terror they exported to the south, we must turn our gaze from the damp fields of England and follow the longships as they rounded the great landmass of Francia, weathered the turbulent waters of the Bay of Biscay, and sailed into a world they had only heard of in half-believed tales, the sun-drenched, wealthy, and utterly unprepared world of the Iberian Peninsula and the Mediterranean Sea. Here, the Northmen would not just be raiders, they would become a geopolitical force, clashing with the most powerful and sophisticated empire of the age, and in doing so, add a new alien dimension to their terrifying reputation. This southern expansion began in earnest in the year 844. A Viking fleet, perhaps numbering over 100 ships, which had been harrying the Atlantic coast of France, sailed south along the coast of Asturias, the small Christian kingdom clinging to the northern mountains of Spain. After some initial, inconclusive skirmishes, the fleet continued south and sailed up the wide, inviting mouth of the Guadalquivir River. Their destination was the magnificent jewel of Muslim Al-Andalus, the city of Ishbiliya, known to us as Seville. At this time, most of the Iberian Peninsula was under the control of the Umayyad Emirate of Córdoba, a civilization that was, in almost every respect, the superior of the Christian kingdoms to the north, to say nothing of the rustic world of Scandinavia. Córdoba was the largest city in Western Europe, a dazzling center of science, poetry, medicine, and architecture. Seville was one of its most important cities, a rich agricultural and commercial hub. It was wealthy, cosmopolitan, and fatally poorly defended, its people having known peace for generations. The arrival of the Northmen was like an apparition from a forgotten barbaric age. The Arab chroniclers of the time, like Ibn al-Qutiyya, refer to them with a mixture of curiosity and horror. They call them the Magus, a term they also used for Zoroastrians, fire worshippers, pagans. The description of the Viking landing and assault on Seville is a familiar story of slaughter and destruction, but told from a new perspective. They put the inhabitants to the sword, one account records, slaying all who fell into their hands, men, women, and children, not even sparing the beasts of burden. For nearly 2 months, the Vikings occupied the ruined city and used it as a base to raid the surrounding countryside, sacking towns and taking thousands of captives. The terror they unleashed was absolute, but the response, when it came, was unlike anything they had faced in the fragmented kingdoms of the north. The ruler of Al-Andalus was the Emir Abd al-Rahman II. He was not a petty king fighting for his own survival. He was the head of a powerful, centralized state with a professional army. He dispatched his best generals and a large, well-equipped force to deal with the pagan invaders. The decisive battle took place at Tablada outside Seville. Here, the Vikings faced a disciplined, cavalry-heavy army, fighting in a hot, dry climate utterly alien to them. The Arab forces employed tactics the Vikings had rarely encountered, including the use of naft, a terrifying incendiary weapon likely related to Greek fire, which they launched from catapults. The result was a crushing defeat for the Northmen. Thousands were killed, hundreds were captured and subsequently hanged from the palm trees of Seville. The dragon ships that were trapped in the river were burned. It was a clear and brutal message. This was not Northumbria. The survivors of the Viking fleet, battered and bloodied, fled back to the sea. But the story does not end there. The raid of 844, while a military failure for the Vikings, was a profound psychological success. They had proven that even the mighty Emir of Cordoba was vulnerable, and they had seen the staggering wealth of the south. The fear they left behind was so profound that Abd al-Rahman II immediately ordered the construction of a permanent fleet and the fortification of Seville with new city walls, an immense expense undertaken solely to prevent a repeat of the Magus invasion. But the Vikings had learned a valuable lesson as well. They had tasted the riches of the Mediterranean world, and they would be back. And return they did in 859 with a new strategy and a new level of audacity. This time, the expedition was led by two of the most infamous Vikings of the age, Hásteinn and Björn Ironside, another supposed son of Ragnar Lothbrok. Their fleet was smaller, perhaps 60 ships, but their ambitions were far grander. Instead of a simple smash-and-grab raid, this was a planned multi-year voyage of exploration and plunder, a grand tour of the Mediterranean. After raiding the coasts of Spain and Morocco, reportedly even capturing and briefly holding the city of Nekor, they did something unprecedented. They sailed through the Pillars of Hercules, the narrow Strait of Gibraltar that separates Africa from Europe, and entered the Mediterranean Sea, a body of water the Romans had called Mare Nostrum, our sea. For the next 2 years, this Viking fleet became a spectre haunting the coasts of the Mediterranean. They sacked cities in the Balearic Islands. They plundered the coast of southern Francia, sacking Narbonne and sailing up the Rhone River to terrorize the countryside as far as Valence. Then they crossed the sea to Italy. It is here that their story, as recorded in the sagas, tips into the realm of the fantastic, blending historical reality with folklore in a way that perfectly illustrates the nature of their legend. Their ultimate goal, the sagas claim, was the greatest city of all, Rome. The eternal city, the heart of Christendom, the seat of the Pope himself. But the Vikings, brilliant navigators but poor geographers, apparently made a slight error. Sailing up the coast of Italy, they came to a magnificent city, gleaming with marble walls and magnificent towers. Believing it to be Rome, they laid siege to it. This city was, in fact, Luna, a prosperous port on the border of Tuscany and Liguria. Unable to take the well-fortified city by storm, the saga of Dudo of St. Quentin tells us that Hásteinn resorted to a trick worthy of Odysseus, a stratagem that reveals the cunning that so often lay behind the Vikings' brutish facade. He sent messengers to the bishop and count of Luna, claiming that he and his men were exiles who had been driven from their homeland. He claimed that he was deathly ill and, having had visions of the Christian God, wished to be baptized and buried in consecrated ground within the city walls. The ruse was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, playing directly on the Christian duty of conversion and charity. The bishop, seeing a chance to save a pagan soul, and perhaps the soul of a powerful chieftain at that, agreed. Hásteinn was brought into the city on a stretcher, accompanied by a small honor guard of his finest warriors, all of whom had their swords concealed beneath their cloaks. He was baptized in a grand ceremony in the city's cathedral. Then, as planned, he died. His men, feigning immense grief, requested that their beloved leader be given a funeral befitting his new Christian status, with a procession to carry his body to the grave. The city leaders, suspecting nothing, agreed. The funeral procession entered the city, with Hásteinn lying on his bier and his warriors marching alongside as a solemn funeral party. Once they were deep inside the city walls, Hásteinn sprang to life. Leaping from his bier, he grabbed a hidden sword and, along with his mourners, began to slaughter the city's astonished and unarmed leaders. They fought their way to the city gates, threw them open, and let in the rest of their army, which had been waiting outside. Luna was sacked with methodical brutality. The Vikings, according to the legend, were immensely proud of their victory until a traveller informed them that this was not, in fact, Rome. Disappointed, they burned the city to the ground and sailed away, leaving behind a cautionary tale that would be told for generations about the dangers of trusting a Viking, no matter how pious he might seem. Whether the story of the sack of Luna is literally true in all its details is debatable, but its symbolic truth is undeniable. It showcases a different kind of Viking fear, the fear of their intelligence, their capacity for deception, their ability to use their opponent's own virtues, their faith, their compassion as weapons against them. They were not just mindless berserkers, they were cunning strategists, wolves who were experts at dressing in sheep's clothing. The Grand Tour continued. After leaving Italy, Hastein and Bjorn's fleet sailed east, possibly raiding the coasts of Sicily and even North Africa. Their journey then took them into the heart of the most powerful and sophisticated empire in the Christian world, the Byzantine Empire, which the Norse called Miklagard, the Great City, or Great Enclosure. While there is no definitive record of them attacking Constantinople itself on this voyage, they certainly raided its outlying territories in the Aegean Sea. To the Byzantines, these Northmen, whom they called the Rose, or Varangians, were yet another barbarian threat in a world full of them, but one distinguished by their ferocity and their incredible skill at sea. The fear they inspired was not the existential, world-ending terror of the Anglo-Saxons, but the weary dread of a great, ancient power facing a new, vigorous, and unpredictable foe. After 2 years of plunder, having amassed a fortune in gold, silver, silks, and slaves, the fleet decided to return home. But on their return journey through the Strait of Gibraltar, they were met by the newly built fleet of the Emir of Córdoba. In a furious naval battle, the Andalusian fleet, using its incendiary weapons, destroyed as many as 40 of the Viking ships. Hastein and Bjorn escaped with a remnant of their fleet, perhaps 20 ships, and limped their way back north, their holds still laden with immense treasure despite their losses. They returned to their bases in France as legends. They had defied the two greatest empires of the Western world, the Franks and the Arabs, and had even tangled with the Byzantines. They had sailed into a world of myth and returned with treasure to prove it was real. Their journey broadcast a terrifying message across Europe. Nowhere was safe, no sea was too distant, no city too great, no empire too powerful to escape the reach of the dragon ships. This Mediterranean expedition fundamentally changed the scope of Viking activity. It opened up a new southern frontier for raiding and, eventually, for settlement. The most famous example of this was in Normandy. The Vikings who had settled at the mouth of the Seine under the leadership of a chieftain named Rollo became such a persistent and destructive threat to the kingdom of West Francia that in 911 the Frankish king Charles the Simple offered Rollo a deal. In the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, Charles granted Rollo and his men the lands around the city of Rouen. In exchange, Rollo had to be baptized, marry the king's daughter, and most importantly, become a vassal of the king and defend the coast of Francia against other Viking raiders. It was a classic, set a thief to catch a thief strategy, and it worked, with consequences that would change the map of Europe. Rollo and his Northmen became the Normans. They adopted the French language, the Christian religion, and the Frankish system of feudalism with astonishing speed, but they did not lose their Viking spirit, their energy, their ambition, their ruthlessness, and their military prowess. They became, in essence, domesticated Vikings, a Christianized warrior elite. The fear they inspired was no longer that of the pagan berserker, but of the disciplined, heavily armored Norman knight on horseback. Within a century and a half, these descendants of Viking raiders would project their power across Europe with breathtaking success. They would conquer southern Italy and Sicily from the Lombards, Byzantines, and Arabs, creating a powerful and cosmopolitan Norman kingdom in the heart of the Mediterranean. And most famously, in 1066, Rollo's great-great-great-grandson, William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, would launch an invasion across the English Channel, defeat the English army at the Battle of Hastings, and seize the crown of England, bringing the Viking Age to a close by placing a man of Viking descent on the English throne. The story of the Normans is the ultimate testament to the Vikings' adaptability. They proved that they could be as adept at state-building and assimilation as they were at destruction, transforming themselves from the terror of Europe into its new masters. The fear had not vanished. It had simply put on a coat of mail, mounted a warhorse, and learned to speak French. To fully map the geography of this fear, we must trace its eastern vector. While Hastein and Bjorn were carving a path of terror through the warm waters of the Mediterranean, their kinsmen were engaged in an enterprise of even greater scale and consequence in the vast, forbidding, and darkly forested lands of Eastern Europe. Here, the Northmen were known by a different name. The Slavic tribes called them the Rus, a name whose origin is still debated but may derive from an Old Norse term for the men who row. The fear they inspired in this world was of a different character. It was less about the sudden, cataclysmic raid on a settled monastery and more about a slow, methodical, and relentless infiltration. It was the fear of the master, the merchant, and the colonizer. It was the terror of being subjugated, of becoming a human resource in a commercial empire built on the river highways that flowed south to the richest cities on earth. This was the story of the Swedish Vikings, the Varangians, and their journey from opportunistic traders to the founders of a nation. The landscape of Eastern Europe in the early 9th century was a mosaic of forests, swamps, and steppe, inhabited by a myriad of Slavic and Finnic tribes. It was a world without large cities, without centralized kingdoms, a vast and untamed wilderness. But running through it was a network of great rivers, the Dnieper, the Don, the Volga. For the Rus, these rivers were not obstacles. They were highways, a liquid infrastructure leading to unimaginable wealth. They were a path to the two great superpowers of the age, the Byzantine Empire, with its magnificent capital of Constantinople, or Miklagard, the great city, and the Abbasid Caliphate, with its sprawling markets in Baghdad and its endless supply of gleaming silver dirhams. The lure of this southern wealth was irresistible, and the Rus developed a unique mode of operation to exploit it. Their method was part of a seasonal, cyclical system. In the spring, as the ice broke on the rivers, small flotillas of Rus traders would set out from their strongholds in the north, places like Aldeigjuborg, Staraya Ladoga, near the Baltic coast. They traveled in smaller, lighter ships than the ocean-going longships, but also in simple monoxyla, dugout canoes carved from a single massive log which they acquired from their Slavic subjects. They would journey down the river systems, a process that was itself a terrifying ordeal. The Arab diplomat and traveller Ahmed ibn Fadlan, who met the Rus on the Volga in 922, left behind an unparalleled and visceral first-hand account of who these people were and how they operated. He describes them as physically imposing. "I have never seen more perfect physical specimens, tall as date palms, blonde and ruddy." But he was also repulsed by what he saw as their utter lack of hygiene, describing them as the filthiest of God's creatures. He recounts in graphic detail their morning ritual of sharing a single bowl of water to wash their faces and clear their throats, a practice that horrified his sensibilities as a refined Muslim courtier. Ibn Fadlan's account also gives us a chilling glimpse into the foundation of their trade. As the Rus traveled down the rivers, they would stop at the fortified trading posts, or gorods, which they had established or taken over. Here, the local Slavic tribes were compelled to bring them tribute. This tribute, the polyudi, was the price of their survival. It consisted of the treasures of the northern forest, lustrous furs from sable, marten, ermine, and beaver, pure white beeswax, essential for the candles of Byzantine churches, wild honey, and, above all, human beings. The Rus were systematic slavers on an industrial scale. They would either demand a tribute of captives from the tribes they dominated, or simply raid and enslave those who resisted. These unfortunate souls, the Sakaliba as the Arabs called them, were chained, collared, and forced onto the Rus ships to be transported south. The journey itself was fraught with peril. The most notorious stretch was on the Dnieper River, a series of 7 rapids that the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus described in detail in his work, De Administrando Imperio. To pass these rapids, the Rus had to unload their ships and carry both their cargo and the vessels themselves overland, a process called portage. During this vulnerable time, they were often attacked by the nomadic Pecheneg tribes of the steppe, fierce horsemen who were the Rus' great rivals. Many a Rus trader met his end in a hail of arrows on the banks of the Dnieper. The fear they inspired in the Slavs was thus mirrored by the fear they themselves felt for the steppe nomads. It was a brutal, unforgiving world where predator and prey were often one and the same. Those who survived the journey would arrive at the great markets of the south. On the Volga route, they would trade with the Khazars and the Volga Bulgars, exchanging their furs and slaves for the silver dirhams that were the hard currency of the era. The sheer volume of this trade is staggering. Tens of thousands of Abbasid coins have been discovered in Viking hordes across Scandinavia and Russia, a testament to the profitability of this eastern enterprise. The other route, down the Dnieper, led to the Black Sea and the ultimate prize, Constantinople. The Rus approached the great city with a mixture of avarice and awe. Their relationship with the Byzantine Empire was a complex dance of trade and terror. They were valuable trading partners, bringing the raw materials the empire desired, but they were also an existential threat. In 860, while the Byzantine Emperor Michael III and his main army were away fighting the Arabs in the east, a massive Rus fleet, perhaps 200 ships, suddenly appeared at the mouth of the Bosphorus. The citizens of Constantinople, who considered their city to be protected by God and the Virgin Mary, were plunged into panic. The Patriarch Photios, in a sermon delivered from the pulpit of the Hagia Sophia, described the Rus as a nation obscure, insignificant, and unknown to us until the expedition against us, a people who had descended like a hailstorm from the far north. He paints a horrifying picture of their savagery in the city's suburbs, of indiscriminate slaughter, of infants dashed against the rocks, and of a cruelty that seemed to come from another dimension. The Rus laid siege to the city, but were ultimately unable to breach its formidable land and sea walls. According to Byzantine accounts, a miraculous storm, summoned by the prayers of the Patriarch and the dipping of the Virgin's sacred robe into the sea, scattered and destroyed the Rus fleet. The Rus attacked again in 907 under a leader named Oleg, Helgi, and again in 941 under a chieftain named Igor, Ingvar. The 941 attack was particularly devastating for the Rus. The Byzantine navy, now prepared, unleashed its most terrifying secret weapon, Greek fire. It was a liquid incendiary, a closely guarded state secret whose chemical composition is still debated, but was likely a petroleum-based mixture that could be projected from siphons mounted on the prows of their ships. It could not be extinguished with water. In fact, it was said to burn even more fiercely on the surface of the sea. The Byzantine princess and historian Anna Komnena would later describe the terror of this weapon, which was often shaped into animal heads on the siphons, making it seem as if lions or other land monsters were roaring fire and vomiting flame. For the Rus, whose entire warfare was based on their wooden ships, it was an encounter with hell itself. Their fleet was incinerated. Liutprand of Cremona, a Lombard ambassador in Constantinople, recorded the aftermath. The Rus, being thus vanquished, returned home in confusion, but in their flight they told the neighboring peoples, "We have fought with the dead. From them we have received no harm, but they have done us great injury." The phrase "fought with the dead" is cryptic, but it perfectly captures the supernatural terror that Greek fire inspired. Yet, despite these military defeats, the Rus always came back. They were too persistent, and their trade was too valuable for the Byzantines to ignore. After each failed attack, a new treaty would be negotiated. These treaties, recorded in the Russian Primary Chronicle, are fascinating documents. They lay out the terms under which Rus merchants could enter Constantinople. They were to be registered, housed in a specific quarter outside the city walls, and were only allowed to enter the city itself in small, unarmed groups under escort. The treaties were a clear attempt by the sophisticated Byzantines to manage and contain the barbarian threat, to profit from their trade while mitigating the danger they posed. But these agreements also legitimized the Rus, elevating their leaders from pirate chieftains to treaty partners with the Emperor of the Romans. Over time, the Rus' presence in the Slavic lands deepened. They were no longer just seasonal traders. Their leaders, who belonged to the semi-legendary Rurik dynasty, established permanent rule over a growing network of cities, with Kiev on the Dnieper becoming their capital. They formed a new hybrid ruling class, a Scandinavian elite governing a vast Slavic population. The fear of the Rus began to change from the terror of the foreign slaver to the fear of the tax collector and the ruling warlord. They established a state, Kievan Rusin, the ancestor of modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The process of assimilation began. The Scandinavian names of the rulers, Oleg, Helgi, Igor, Ingvar, Olga, Helga, gradually gave way to Slavic names like Sviatoslav and Vladimir. The career of Sviatoslav, who ruled in the mid-10th century, represents the zenith of the old-style pagan Viking prince in the east. He was a pure warrior, described by a Byzantine chronicler as having a shaved head with a single lock of hair, the Oseledets, later associated with the Cossacks, a wispy moustache and a single gold earring. He spent his entire reign on campaign, expanding his empire with ruthless efficiency. He destroyed the Khazar Khaganate, the Rus' great commercial rival on the steppe, and campaigned deep into the Balkans, carving out a new empire on the Danube. He is said to have sent a stark message to his enemies before attacking: "I wish to go against you." It was a declaration of pure, confident aggression. He fought like a traditional Viking, sleeping on the ground with his saddle as a pillow, sharing the hardships of his men. His ambition, however, outstripped his power. His campaigns in the Balkans brought him into direct conflict with the full might of the Byzantine Empire under the soldier emperor John the Pessimiskes. After a series of brutal battles, Sviatoslav was defeated, besieged in the fortress of Dorostelon, and forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty. On his journey back to Kiev in 972, he was ambushed and killed at the Dnieper Rapids by the Pechenegs who, according to the chronicle, had been bribed by the Byzantines. The Pecheneg Khan had Sviatoslav's skull lined with gold and made into a drinking cup, a final, barbaric tribute to a fearsome enemy. Sviatoslav's death marked a turning point. His son, Vladimir the Great, realized that the future of the Rus state lay not in endless pagan raiding, but in joining the great family of Christian nations. The primary chronicle tells a dramatic, if likely apocryphal, story of Vladimir's conversion. He supposedly sent envoys to investigate the major religions of the world. The Muslim Bulgars on the Volga told him of Islam, but Vladimir rejected it, famously declaring, "Drinking is the joy of all Rus. We cannot exist without that pleasure." The envoys who went to the Germans reported that their form of Western Christianity was dull and joyless. But the envoys who went to Constantinople returned utterly spellbound. They had been taken to the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral, during a service. "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth," they reported. "For on earth there is no such splendor or such beauty, and we are at a loss how to describe it. We only know that God dwells there among men." Convinced by this report and by the strategic advantages of an alliance with the powerful Byzantine Empire, Vladimir made his move. He embraced Orthodox Christianity. In 988, he underwent a mass baptism of his people in the Dnieper River at Kiev. This event, the baptism of Rus, was a moment of profound transformation. It integrated the Rus into the Byzantine cultural and religious sphere, bringing with it literacy, stone architecture, icon painting, and a new legal and moral framework. The old Norse gods, Perun and Odin, were thrown into the river. The Rus state had joined Christendom. The fear of the Rus did not disappear overnight, but it was fundamentally altered. The pagan Viking raider, the Magus, the terrifying other, was gone. In his place stood a Christian prince, a partner of the Byzantine emperor, but the martial spirit remained. In a final, fascinating twist, the very people who had once been the terror of Constantinople became its most trusted protectors. Rus warriors seeking wealth and honor began to travel to the great city to serve as elite mercenaries for the emperor. They formed the core of the legendary Varangian Guard. This was the emperor's personal bodyguard, a corps elite renowned for its terrifying battlefield prowess, its unswerving loyalty, bought with vast sums of gold. and its signature weapon, the great two-handed Dane axe. For centuries, these descendants of the Vikings stood as the last line of defense for the Byzantine emperors, their fearsome reputation now a shield for the empire they had once sought to destroy. The story of the Rus is therefore a story of a fear that evolved, from the terror of the slaver on the river, to the dread of the pagan besieging the walls of God's city, to the awe-inspiring fear commanded by the emperor's own axe-wielding guards. It was a journey from predator to prince to protector, a transformation that laid the foundations of Eastern Europe. The fear had a sound. It was the splintering of a church door, the roar of pagan war cries, the weeping of captives. But by the latter half of the 9th century, for the people of England, the fear had a new sound: silence. It was the silence of a road where no merchants travelled, the silence of a monastery where no bells tolled, the silence of a king's hall where no laws were passed. The great heathen army had consumed them. The kingdom of Northumbria was a Viking puppet state, its capital the bustling Norse city of Jorvik. East Anglia was conquered, its martyred king a half-remembered ghost. The great central kingdom of Mercia had been partitioned and broken. By the winter of 877, only one Anglo-Saxon kingdom remained, a flickering candle against a hurricane. This was Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons, and its king, a young man named Alfred, was about to be driven into the mud, a fugitive in his own land. This is the story of fear at its absolute zenith, the moment when it seemed to have won, and of the profound transformation that was born from that dark and desperate hour. Alfred was not, by nature, a warrior king in the mold of his ancestors. He was a scholar, a man of profound Christian piety who had twice been taken to Rome as a child and was fascinated by learning and literature. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the great record of his age, portrays him as a man plagued by ill health, but blessed with a powerful, inquisitive intellect. He ascended to the throne of Wessex in 871, a year of relentless bloodshed that saw 9 major battles fought against the Vikings. He inherited not a kingdom, but a desperate losing war. For 7 years, he fought, he negotiated, he paid tribute, he did whatever was necessary to keep his kingdom alive, to hold back the tide. But in January of 878, the tide finally broke. In a surprise winter attack, a Viking army under the chieftain Guthrum stormed Alfred's royal estate at Chippenham in the dead of night. The assault was so sudden and overwhelming that the West Saxon army was scattered. The kingdom, for all intents and purposes, collapsed. Alfred, with a small handful of loyal followers, escaped the slaughter with nothing but the clothes on his back and vanished into the wilderness. He found refuge in the great Somerset Levels, a vast, trackless landscape of marshes, fens, and swampy islands. Here, in this watery labyrinth, the king of the last free English kingdom became a guerrilla fighter, a hunted outlaw. This is the period of the famous legends that surround Alfred, stories that, while likely apocryphal, speak to the totality of his defeat. The most famous is the tale of the cakes. Taking shelter in the hut of a swineherd, the disguised king was asked by the woman of the house to watch the cakes she had baking on the hearth. Consumed by the weight of his kingdom's destruction, his mind racing with desperate plans, he forgot his humble task. The cakes burned. The woman returned and, unaware of who he was, gave the king a furious scolding for his laziness and incompetence. The story's endurance speaks to a profound truth. It illustrates a king reduced to his barest humanity, a man who had lost everything, who was powerless even to perform the simplest chore. He had become a ghost in his own land, the fear of the Vikings made manifest in the person of a defeated king hiding in a swamp. From his island fortress of Athelney, a small patch of dry land hidden deep within the marshes, Alfred began to wage a desperate, asymmetric war. He and his small band of warriors would emerge from the fens to ambush Viking patrols and harry their supply lines. But more importantly, he sent out messengers, secret riders who picked their way through the occupied land, carrying a message of hope and a summons to war. The message was for the Fyrds, the militias of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. It told them that their king was alive, and that he was calling upon them to muster, to gather at an ancient landmark known as Egbert Stone. It was a desperate gamble. For months, these men had believed their king was dead and their cause was lost. They had been living under the shadow of Viking occupation, a life of fear and submission. Alfred was asking them to risk everything, their lives, their farms, their families, on one last, seemingly hopeless stand. And they came. The chronicle records the moment with a surge of emotion that is rare in its terse, factual prose. And when they saw the king, they were filled with great joy. It was a reunion of a people and their leader, a reforging of a broken kingdom in a remote forest clearing. From this assembly, Alfred marched his newly formed army to face Guthrum and the main body of the great heathen army. The fate of the English people would be decided at a place called Edington. The battle, when it came, was not one of clever tactics or cavalry charges. It was a brutal, primordial struggle, a shield wall against a shield wall. For hours, the two armies stood face to face, a grinding, shoving, hacking contest of attrition. It was a test of nerve, of endurance, of sheer will. And on that day, the West Saxons, fighting for their homes, their faith, and their very existence, held their ground. They did not break. It was the Vikings who finally gave way. Their shield wall fractured, they fled in panic to their fortress at Chippenham, and Alfred's army surrounded them. After a siege of 14 days, starving and defeated, Guthrum surrendered. The victory at Edington was more than a military triumph. It was a psychological resurrection. It was the moment the English stopped being the hunted and started fighting back. The peace treaty that followed, known as the Treaty of Wedmore, was a work of Alfred's political genius. He did not seek to annihilate his defeated foe. Instead, he forced Guthrum and 29 of his chief men to do something remarkable, to accept Christian baptism, with Alfred himself standing as Guthrum's godfather. In this single act, Alfred symbolically brought his pagan enemy into his own Christian world, transforming the godless barbarian into a fellow Christian prince. The treaty also formally divided England. The Vikings would keep control of the north and east, a territory that would become known as the Danelaw. Wessex and its dependencies in the south and west would be Alfred's. A border was drawn, and for the first time, a fragile peace settled over the land. But Alfred knew this was only a reprieve. The fear had receded, but it had not vanished. He understood that the Vikings were not a problem that could be solved by a single battle. They were a permanent condition, and to survive, his kingdom had to fundamentally evolve. The rest of Alfred's reign was dedicated to a revolutionary program of military and social reorganization, a systemic response to the Viking threat. He analyzed the sources of Viking success, their speed, their ability to strike anywhere, their use of fortified camps, and he engineered a brilliant and comprehensive defense system to counter each one. His first and most important innovation was the creation of the Burgal system. Alfred recognized that static defense in a single royal army was useless against the fluid, hit-and-run tactics of the Vikings. The solution was to create a network of defended places, of fortified towns or burhs. A unique document that survives from the reign of his son, Edward, called the Burgal Hedage, lists 33 of these burhs across Wessex and Mercia. They were strategically placed so that no part of the kingdom was more than 20 miles or a day's march from the safety of a fortified town. These were not just castles for a lord, they were proto-cities, designed as centers of both military defense and civilian life. The defenses were massive, great earth ramparts, often reinforced with timber and fronted by a wide ditch. The layout was often a planned, grid-like street pattern, a feature of Roman town planning that had been absent from England for centuries. Each burh was assigned a garrison, its size calculated based on the length of the walls. The formula was 4 men for every 5.5 yards of wall. The surrounding landowners were responsible for providing these men and for the upkeep of the fortifications. The Burgal system was an architecture of survival. It took away the Vikings' greatest advantage, their mobility. Raiders could no longer plunder at will because a garrison was always close by, ready to sally out and attack them, and a safe refuge was always near for the rural population. It changed the strategic calculus of the entire war. Secondly, Alfred reformed the army itself. The traditional Anglo-Saxon fyrd was a militia of all free men, but it was slow to assemble and could only stay in the field for a short time before the men had to return to their farms. This was inadequate against a persistent Viking threat. Alfred's solution, described in the Chronicle, was brilliant in its simplicity. He split the fyrd in two. One half would be on active duty, manning the burhs or serving in the field army, while the other half remained at home, tending the crops and livestock. They would then rotate. This innovation, for the first time, gave Wessex something akin to a standing army, a permanent, professionalized defensive force that could respond quickly and stay in the field indefinitely. The fear of being attacked while the army was disbanded vanished. Thirdly, and perhaps most remarkably, Alfred realized that to defeat an enemy that came from the sea, you had to be able to fight them on the sea. He ordered the construction of a navy, but he did not simply copy the Viking longship. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states that Alfred's ships were built to his own design. They were swifter, steadier, and also higher than the Viking ships. They had as many as 60 oars, twice that of a typical longship. They were not raiding vessels designed to carry men and plunder. They were warships, designed to fight and sink other ships. They were built to be floating fortresses, their height giving their crews an advantage in a ship-to-ship battle, allowing them to rain down spears and arrows on the lower-slung Viking vessels. While Alfred's navy had mixed success in his lifetime, it was a visionary concept. It represented a fundamental shift in strategic thinking, from a passive, land-based defense to an active, offensive posture that took the fight to the enemy in their own element. Alfred's reforms were not just military. He believed that the Viking invasions were a divine punishment for the decline of learning and piety in his kingdom. He therefore embarked on an ambitious program of cultural and educational renewal. He lamented that when he came to the throne, there were very few men south of the Humber who could even understand the Latin of their own church services. To remedy this, he invited scholars from across Britain and Europe to his court. He then initiated a revolutionary translation program, rendering the most important works of Latin Christian thought, works by Pope Gregory the Great, by Augustine, by Boethius, into Old English, the language of his people. He often wrote the prefaces and translated parts of the books himself. It was an effort to restore the soul of his kingdom, to ensure that his people understood the faith they were fighting to defend. This cultural revival was as much a part of his defense against the Vikings as the Burhs and the navy. He was fighting not just for territory, but for a civilization. In Alfred, the fear of the Vikings met its match. It met an intellect that could dissect it, understand its mechanics, and engineer a response. The system Alfred created was so successful that his children, Edward and Ethelfled, the Lady of the Mercians, were able to go on the offensive, systematically rolling back the Danelaw and, by the middle of the next century, uniting the disparate Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into a single, unified entity, the Kingdom of England. The very nation of England was, in this sense, forged in the crucible of the Viking terror. The fear did not break the English. It forced them to innovate, to organize, and to unify in ways they never had before. It was the existential threat of the Northmen that necessitated the creation of the national institutions, a standing army, a navy, a network of national defense, a shared written culture that would define the English state for 1,000 years. The fear was real, it was devastating, and it very nearly extinguished the English people. But in the end, it was the dark catalyst that brought their nation into being. Fear possesses a strange kind of gravity. It can pull a society into a state of paralysis and collapse, but it can also, under immense pressure, fuse disparate elements into something new, something dense and hard and unexpectedly resilient. By the dawn of the 10th century, the raw, chaotic terror of the initial Viking Age had begun to cool and crystallize into new political and cultural realities. The Northmen were no longer just a horrifying other. They were neighbors. They were rulers. They were, in some places, becoming indistinguishable from the people they had once terrorized. This was the age of assimilation and synthesis, a period when the lines blurred between Viking and native, pagan and Christian. But to see this process as the simple end of fear would be a profound misreading of the era. The fear did not vanish, it was transmuted. It became the fear of the hybrid, the anxiety of a world where identities were fluid and the enemy no longer had a single, recognizable face. It was the tension of living in a half-breed world, a world exemplified by the strange, brutal, and vibrant kingdom that grew in the north of England, the Danelaw. The Danelaw was not a single, unified kingdom. The term itself is a retrospective one, appearing in sources from the 11th century to describe the part of England where Danish law held sway. It was a sprawling territory, covering everything north and east of the old Roman road of Watling Street, which ran from London to Chester. It was a mosaic of Viking earldoms, petty kingdoms and independent armies, centred on the great fortified towns, the 5 boroughs of Lincoln, Stamford, Leicester, Derby and Nottingham, and ruled from the Viking capital of Jorvik. For an Anglo-Saxon living in Wessex under Alfred's heirs, the Danelaw was a source of constant, low-grade fear. It was a frontier, a borderland with a rival power, a source of potential raids and political instability. But for the people living within the Danelaw, life was a complex negotiation, a daily navigation of a world remade. The terror here was no longer the threat of a burning raid, but the subtler pressure of cultural and legal domination. The ruling class was Norse. The Jarls and their military retainers, the Herseers, imposed their own legal system. Justice was administered not in the old Anglo-Saxon courts, but in assemblies of freemen where disputes were settled according to Scandinavian custom. The very language of the law changed. The basic land division in the Danelaw was the ploughland, or karukate, a Norse measurement, and a village was often called a bye, the Old Norse word for a settlement. A trip through the modern English countryside is a journey through this linguistic conquest. Any town name ending in bye, like Grimsby or Whitby, Thorpe, meaning an outlying farmstead, like Scunthorpe, or Thwaite, a clearing like Braithwaite, is a fossil of this Viking settlement, a map of the Danelaw written on the land itself. For an English farmer, to speak of his own home, his own fields, in the language of his conquerors was a daily reminder of his subjugated status. And yet, the process was not one of simple replacement. It was a fusion. The Vikings were a minority, a warrior aristocracy ruling over a much larger Anglo-Saxon population. They took English wives and concubines, willingly or by force. Their children grew up speaking both Old Norse and Old English, and over time the two languages began to merge. Old English, the language of Beowulf, was a highly inflected Germanic language, complex and rich. Old Norse was a related but distinct North Germanic language. The intense contact between the two in the Danelaw had a remarkable effect. It stripped down the grammar of English, simplifying its endings and streamlining its syntax. But it also injected a huge amount of new vocabulary into the language. Everyday words that we still use are direct borrowings from the Old Norse of the Danelaw Vikings. Words like sky, skin, leg, window, from vindauga or windeye, egg, knife, and even the pronouns they, them, and their are all gifts from the Northmen. The very language we are speaking now is a hybrid, a product of this period of tense cohabitation. The fear of the Viking became, over generations, the grammar of his descendants. The religious landscape was equally complex and fraught with a unique kind of spiritual anxiety. The leadership of the Danelaw, men like Guthrum, who had been baptized at sword point, adopted a veneer of Christianity, but their pagan beliefs did not simply evaporate. Instead, a strange and fascinating religious syncretism occurred. This fusion is most powerfully visible in the stone carvings of the era. The Gosforth Cross, a magnificent towering stone cross from the 10th century in Cumbria, is a perfect example. From a distance, it is unmistakably a Christian monument, a symbol of the crucifixion. But look closer, and the carvings depict scenes not from the Bible, but from Norse mythology. Here is the god Loki, bound and suffering. There is the god Vidar, tearing open the jaws of the monstrous wolf Fenrir. And at the base, what appears to be a depiction of the final, apocalyptic battle of Ragnarok. The artist, and the community he served, saw no contradiction in this. For them, the story of Christ's sacrifice and resurrection could be mapped onto the story of the death and rebirth of the Norse gods. Christ on the cross becomes a heroic figure like Odin hanging on the world tree Yggdrasil to gain wisdom. The struggle against Satan becomes the gods' final battle against the giants. It was a way of making the new faith comprehensible through the lens of the old, a way of hedging one's spiritual bets. Was it true conversion, or was it the ultimate act of cultural appropriation, the Vikings taking the Christian god and making him one of their own? For a devout Anglo-Saxon missionary, this blending of the sacred and the profane, this placing of pagan monsters on the very symbol of his faith, must have inspired a profound kind of theological horror. This hybrid world, this half-Viking, half-English frontier, was inherently unstable. The descendants of Alfred, the kings of the House of Wessex, saw the reconquest of the Danelaw as their sacred duty. Throughout the first half of the 10th century, Alfred's son Edward the Elder and his formidable daughter Ethelfled, the Lady of the Mercians, waged a slow, grinding war of reconquest, building their own burhs and pushing the frontier ever northward. By 954, Alfred's grandson, Edred, had finally expelled the last Viking king of Jorvik, a man whose name encapsulated the entire bloody history of the age, Eric Bloodaxe. For a brief, golden period, it seemed that the fear had been conquered. The Kingdom of England was united under a single West Saxon king, but the fear had only been dormant. By the 980s, a new and more terrible wave of raids began. This was the Second Viking Age, and the fear it brought was different again. The raiders of the First Age were often independent chieftains leading private armies in search of land and plunder. The raiders of the Second Age were something far more terrifying. They were the official, state-sponsored armies of the newly consolidated and powerful kingdoms of Scandinavia itself. These were not pirates. This was an invasion by a nation-state led by kings like Svein Forkbeard of Denmark. The raids were larger, better organized, and aimed not at settlement, but at systematic extortion on a national scale. The Danegeld returned with a vengeance, reaching astronomical sums that crippled the English economy. The English king of the time, Ethelred the Unready, his nickname a corruption of unrad, meaning ill-advised, seemed powerless to stop the onslaught. His policies vacillated between appeasement and panicked violence. The fear and paranoia of this era reached a fever pitch on St. Brice's Day, November 13th, 1002. Ethelred, believing that the Danish men living in England, many of whom were assimilated descendants of the first settlers, were plotting to kill him and his councillors, ordered a general massacre. The St. Brice's Day massacre was an act of state-sponsored ethnic cleansing, a brutal explosion of pent-up fear and hatred. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reports that the king ordered all the Danish men who were in England to be killed because he had been told they would faithlessly bereave him of his life. How widespread the massacre truly was is unknown, but in places like Oxford, archaeological evidence shows a mass grave containing the remains of dozens of men of Scandinavian origin, all of whom had been violently killed. The victims included Gunhilda, the sister of King Svein Forkbeard himself, who was in England as a hostage. This act of panicked savagery was a catastrophic miscalculation. It was born of fear, and it created a motivation for revenge that would seal the fate of Anglo-Saxon England. When news reached Svein Forkbeard that his sister had been murdered, his campaign of extortion transformed into a relentless war of conquest. For the next decade, his armies ravaged England with a methodical fury. The fear was no longer of a raid, but of total annihilation. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Ælfhere, was captured during the sack of his city in 1012. The Vikings demanded a huge ransom for his release. The Archbishop, seeing the poverty of his people, refused to allow the money to be paid. He was martyred by the drunken Viking army, who pelted him to death with animal bones and skulls from their feast before one of their number finally dispatched him with an axe blow to the head. His death symbolized the complete breakdown of the old order. In 1013, Svein Forkbeard landed in England not as a raider, but as an invader at the head of a massive fleet, and the kingdom collapsed before him. Ethelred the Unready fled into exile in Normandy. Svein Forkbeard was proclaimed king of all England. The fear had finally won. A Viking sat on the throne. Although Svein died only 5 weeks later, his son, Knut the Great, would carry on his father's conquest. After a final, brutal war with Ethelred's warrior son, Edmund Ironside, Knut became the undisputed King of England in 1016. And then, something extraordinary happened. The fear stopped. Knut, the son of the man who had terrorized England for a generation, proved to be one of the most effective, peaceful, and pious kings in the country's history. He was no longer a Viking raider. He was a European monarch, the head of a vast North Sea empire that included not only England, but also Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. He did not rule England as a conquered province. He ruled it as an English king. He embraced the Anglo-Saxon system of law, issued law codes in the English tradition, and became a great patron of the English church, building and endowing monasteries, including the one at Canterbury whose archbishop his own men had murdered. He made a pilgrimage to Rome, where he was accepted as a major Christian sovereign by the Pope. The ultimate symbol of this transformation is the famous story of Canute and the waves. As told by the chronicler Henry of Huntingdon, Canute, tired of the flattery of his courtiers, had his throne placed on the seashore and commanded the incoming tide to halt. When the waves inevitably washed over his feet, he declared, "Let all men know how empty and worthless is the power of kings, for there is none worthy of the name, but he whom heaven, earth, and sea obey by eternal laws." The story is often misinterpreted as an act of arrogance, but its true meaning is one of profound Christian humility. The Viking sea king was publicly demonstrating his submission to a power greater than his own, the power of the Christian God. Under Canute, the Anglo-Saxons and the Danes were formally reconciled. He became a figure of peace and stability. The fear of the Viking, which had dominated English life for over 2 centuries, was finally laid to rest, not by defeating the Viking, but by the Viking becoming English. The long and bloody saga had ended in a complete and total synthesis. The terror had been so absolute and so persistent that the only way to end it was for the two peoples to become one, ruled by a king who embodied both their identities. The final legacy of the Viking fear in England was not a legacy of destruction, but the creation of a new Anglo-Scandinavian nation, a nation that was tougher, more worldly, and more complex than it had been before the first dragon ships ever touched the sacred sands of Lindisfarne. Fear, in its purest, most primal form, is a reaction to the unknown. It is the shadow that flickers at the edge of the firelight, the unnatural noise that breaks the stillness of the dark, the thing that comes from a place beyond the map's edge, a place where monsters are born. The terror of the Viking Age, in its violent infancy, was precisely this. The Northmen were a force of nature that had erupted from the grey, mythological void of the sea, a people whose motives seemed as inscrutable as a winter storm, and whose gods were alien demons demanding blood and fire. They were chaos given form. But by the 11th century, the world had changed. The map, once a parchment of vast and terrifying blanks, was being filled in. The Northmen were no longer an unknown quantity. They were a known variable in the complex equation of European power politics. They were kings in the unified realm of England. They were dukes in the formidable Duchy of Normandy. They were the founding princes of the sprawling Rus lands in the east, and they were the gilded, axe-wielding guards of the emperor in Constantinople. The fear of the pagan marauder, the godless wraith from the sea, had largely subsided, replaced by the more conventional, more comprehensible fears of dynastic struggle, feudal obligation, and territorial warfare. The Viking Age, as a distinct historical and cultural phenomenon, was drawing to its close. But the ghost of that original terror, the cultural DNA it had violently imprinted upon a continent, did not simply evaporate with the baptism of the last pagan king. It lingered, a powerful and resonant echo in the epics, the laws, the languages, and the very bloodlines of the new world it had helped to forge. The final chapter of the Viking fear is therefore not a simple story of its end, but a far more complex tale of its afterlife. Its final, spectacular, world-altering flare-ups, and its slow, fascinating transmutation from a lived, visceral reality into a powerful and enduring myth. The year 1066 is the date that every English schoolchild learns. It is traditionally presented as the stark dividing line, the year England ceased to be Anglo-Saxon and became Norman. But it is more than that. It stands as one of the most dramatic and consequential years in all of European history, a fulcrum upon which the fate of nations turned. It was a year of 3 kings, 3 epic battles, and a desperate 3-way struggle for the crown of England that was, at its very heart, the final, convulsive, and bloody act of the long and tangled saga of Viking involvement in the island. It was the year the Viking legacy went to war with itself. The stage was set in January with the death of the English king, Edward the Confessor. Edward was a man who embodied the transitional nature of his era, born of an Anglo-Saxon king, Ethelred the Unready, and a Norman mother, Emma. He had spent much of his youth in exile at the Norman court. He was deeply pious, more monk than king, and he died without a child, leaving behind a contested throne and a web of half-kept promises that was about to ignite a firestorm. The English witan, the council of the great nobles and churchmen of the realm, did not hesitate. They immediately acclaimed Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex and the most powerful man in England, as the new king. Harold was the perfect symbol of the new, unified, Anglo-Scandinavian England that had emerged from the Crucible. His father was the mighty Earl Godwin of Wessex, an Englishman of immense ambition. His mother, Githa, was a Danish noblewoman, the sister of an earl who had been a close companion of Knut the Great. Harold was a proven statesman, a brilliant general, and a man who commanded the loyalty of the English nobility. His coronation was a statement of national sovereignty, a declaration that England would choose its own king. But in the wider world, his crown was seen as a usurpation, and 2 men, 2 fearsome predators from across the sea, began to sharpen their claws. The first and most formidable was William, the Duke of Normandy. He was known to his enemies as William the Bastard, the illegitimate son of Duke Robert the Magnificent and a tanner's daughter. His claim to the English throne was legally tenuous based on a supposed promise made to him by his kinsman, King Edward, years earlier, and reinforced by a notorious oath of fealty that Harold Godwinson himself had been forced to swear to William after being shipwrecked on the Norman coast. But what William lacked in legal clarity, he more than made up for in ruthless determination and military genius. His entire life had been a brutal struggle for survival. He had inherited the ducal title as a child and spent his youth navigating a treacherous world of assassination plots and baronial revolts. He had clawed his way to absolute power in his own duchy, crushing his enemies with unpardonable cruelty. He was the product of the Viking legacy disciplined by a century and a half of French feudalism. He was the Viking as a state builder, a master of logistics, law, and organized violence. When news of Harold's coronation reached him, his response was not one of rage, but of cold, calculated preparation. He began to assemble the largest amphibious invasion force Europe had seen since the days of the Roman Empire, framing his enterprise not as a naked grab for power, but as a holy crusade to punish a perjurer, even securing a papal banner from Rome to legitimize his cause. He was the domesticated fear, the terror rationalized, armored in mail, and organized into a devastatingly efficient military-industrial complex. The second claimant came from the east, from the old Viking heartland of Norway. He was a man who seemed to have walked directly out of the pages of the heroic age, a living, breathing saga hero. This was Harald Sigurdsson, the King of Norway, a man known to history and his contemporaries by a fearsome and well-earned moniker, Hardrada, the Hard Ruler. If William represented the future of the Viking spirit, Harald Hardrada was its magnificent, terrifying past. At nearly 7 feet tall, he was a giant of a man, a brilliant skaldic poet, a wily politician, and arguably the most famous and experienced warrior in the entire Christian world. His life had been a relentless odyssey of violence, exile, and adventure. As a 15-year-old boy, he had fought and been grievously wounded at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, a battle where his own half-brother, King Olaf, was killed and later canonized as the patron saint of Norway. Forced into exile, Harold made his way down the great river roads of the Rus, the path his ancestors had blazed, to the court of Yaroslav the Wise in Kiev. From there, his ambition and his sword led him to the ultimate destination for a warrior seeking fame and fortune, Miklagard, Constantinople. For a decade, Harold served in the elite Varangian Guard, the Byzantine Emperor's personal bodyguard. He rose through the ranks to become its commander, the Akaluthos, and led the guard in brutal campaigns across the empire. He fought the Saracens in Sicily, putting down rebellions with methodical ferocity. He battled pirates in the Aegean. He campaigned in Bulgaria and Anatolia. He even made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, fighting in the streets of Jerusalem. He was said to have personally blinded a Bulgarian rebel leader and to have escaped from a Byzantine prison by seducing a noble lady. Along the way, he amassed a colossal fortune in plunder and imperial pay, a treasure so vast that he had to periodically send it north to Kiev for safekeeping. He was a man who had seen the whole world and had tried to conquer most of it. Eventually, he returned to Norway, his longships so laden with gold and treasure that they sat dangerously low in the water. He used this immense wealth to force his nephew, the reigning king, to accept him as co-ruler, and upon his nephew's convenient death soon after, he became the sole king of Norway. His claim to the English throne was the flimsiest of the three, based on an obscure political deal made between his predecessor and one of Knut's sons. But his true claim was the ancient, simple, and terrifying claim of the Viking hero, the right of the strongest, the right of the man who believed he could take and hold a kingdom through the sheer force of his will and the sharpness of his sword. He was the old fear-made flesh, the pagan spirit of conquest in its purest, most undiluted
In the late summer
form.
of 1066, this perfect storm broke upon England.
Harold Hardrada struck first. In September, he sailed from the Solent Islands off the coast of Norway with a fleet of some 300 ships, a force comparable in size to the great heathen army of old. His ambition was to resurrect Knut's North Sea Empire and rule it from England. He sailed across the North Sea, picking up allies in Orkney and Scotland, and was joined by a crucial, bitter figure, Tostig Godwinson, the exiled and resentful brother of King Harold of England. Tostig had been driven out of his earldom of Northumbria by a popular revolt the previous year, an act he blamed on his brother's machinations. He was the catalyst, the treacherous insider who provided Hardrada with vital intelligence and a veneer of legitimacy. Together, they sailed up the Humber and the Ouse and marched on the great northern city of York, the heart of the old Danelaw, where they expected the local Anglo-Scandinavian population to welcome them as liberators. The northern English earls, Edwin and Morcar, hastily assembled an army to defend their city. The two forces clashed on September 20th at the Battle of Fulford Gate. The battle was a bloody and decisive victory for the invaders. The English shield wall was outflanked and shattered. The northern army was annihilated. The city of York surrendered to the Norwegian king. For a fleeting moment, it seemed that the dream of a new Viking empire was about to be realized. The old fear had returned, larger than life and seemingly triumphant. King Harold of England, who had been anxiously waiting on the south coast for William of Normandy's inevitable invasion, was now faced with a catastrophic crisis. With his kingdom's northern army destroyed, he had to act with lightning speed. In a feat of generalship that remains legendary, Harold gathered his elite royal bodyguard, the housecarls, professional, heavily armed soldiers who were themselves the product of Canut's Anglo-Danish military system, and marched them and the southern militias north. They covered the roughly 190 miles from London to York in an astonishing 4 days. The speed of his advance was so incredible that he caught the Norwegian army completely unprepared. On September 25th, Hardrada and Tostig had marched their army out of York to a rendezvous point at Stamford Bridge to receive hostages and provisions. It was a warm, sunny day, and confident in their victory, many of the Norwegian warriors had left their heavy mailcoats, their burnies, behind with the ships, some 20 miles away. As they rested by the River Derwent, they saw a cloud of dust on the horizon, the sun glinting off what they assumed were the helmets of the approaching English hostages. It was only when the banners of the Golden Dragon of Wessex became visible that the terrible truth dawned on them. This was not a party of supplicants, it was the entire royal army of England, and it was charging straight for them. The battle that followed was one of the most savage and epic in English history. A small contingent of Norwegians holding the west bank of the river was quickly overwhelmed. The main battle took place for control of the narrow wooden bridge itself. The Norse sagas, particularly the one in Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, tell the heroic tale of a single, giant Norwegian axeman who held the bridge alone against the entire English army. He stood, a berserk figure of defiance, cutting down every Englishman who dared to approach him, supposedly felling some 40 men. The English could not pass. The stalemate was finally broken when an English soldier, with ingenious courage, floated under the bridge in a half-barrel or swill tub and thrust his spear up through the wooden planks, mortally wounding the giant from below. With the bridge cleared, the English army poured across and fell upon the main, unarmoured body of the Norwegian force. Hardrada, fighting like a demon at the front of his men, a great two-handed sword in his hands, was finally brought down, an arrow striking him in the windpipe. With their king dead, Tostig took command, but he too was soon slain. The battle turned into a rout and then a massacre. The Norwegian defeat was so total that of the 300 ships that had brought the mighty army to England, fewer than 25 were needed to carry the broken survivors home. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was the bloody death knell of the old Viking ambition in England. It was a symbolic and cataclysmic end to an era, a pyre upon which the heroic age burned itself out. But as Harold Godwinson stood victorious amidst the carnage in the north, the winds in the English Channel, which had been blowing from the north for weeks, holding William of Normandy's fleet in port, finally changed. 3 days after Harold's stunning victory, on September 28th, William of Normandy's invasion force, hundreds of ships, thousands of men, and, crucially, a prefabricated wooden castle and a vast cavalry contingent, landed unopposed on the south coast of England at Pevensey. Harold, receiving the disastrous news, was forced into an impossible decision. He had to turn his exhausted, battle-weary army around and force-march them another 250 miles south to confront this new, fresh, and even more dangerous invasion. On October the 14th, the two armies finally met on a ridge near the small market town of Hastings. The English, fighting in their traditional manner on foot, formed an almost impenetrable shield wall along the crest of the hill. The Normans, a combined arms force of archers, infantry, and their primary weapon, the heavily armoured knight on horseback, had to attack uphill into a seemingly unbreakable defensive position. For an entire day, the battle raged, a brutal and deafening clash of two military systems and two worlds. The Norman archers loosed clouds of arrows, but they had little effect against the interlocked wall of shields. The Norman infantry slogged their way up the hill, only to be repulsed by the ferocious English defence. Again and again, William sent his knights charging up the slope, their lances levelled, but they could not break the English line. The English housecarls, wielding their terrifying two-handed Dane axes, wrought horrific carnage, cleaving through helmets and armour and hacking the legs from beneath the Norman warhorses. The shield wall held. At several points during the long day, the Norman army, particularly the Breton contingent on the left flank, broke and fled back down the hill. A rumour spread through the ranks that Duke William himself had been killed. Panic began to set in, but William, demonstrating his immense personal courage and leadership, rode among his retreating troops, tearing his helmet from his head so they could see his face, shouting that he was alive and that victory was still possible. As the day wore on, William's tactical genius began to turn the tide. He turned the earlier, genuine flight of his men into a deliberate stratagem. He ordered his knights to charge the line and then feign retreat, a tactic designed to lure small groups of the less disciplined English fieldmen to break formation and chase them down the hill. Once the foolish Englishmen were isolated on the open ground, their shield wall protection gone, the Norman cavalry would turn on them and cut them to pieces. This costly tactic was repeated throughout the afternoon, slowly and brutally whittling down the English numbers. William also ordered his archers to change their tactics, to fire not directly at the shield wall, but high into the air, so their arrows would plunge down on the men standing in the rear ranks. As evening began to fall, with the light fading and both sides reaching the point of utter exhaustion, the final, decisive moment came. King Harold Godwinson, fighting on foot at the head of his men, was killed. The Bayeux Tapestry, the famous embroidered chronicle of the conquest, famously depicts him being struck in the eye by a stray arrow. While this may have happened, it is more likely, according to other sources, that he was cut down and hacked to pieces by a small group of Norman knights who finally broke through the line around his personal standard. With the death of their king and his two brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, who had fallen earlier in the day, the morale of the English army finally broke. The great shield wall, which had held for 9 hours, disintegrated. The Norman conquest was complete. The Battle of Hastings was the final bloody act in the long and complex drama of the Viking Age in England. It was a contest between the 3 primary heirs of the Viking legacy. The heroic, old-world Viking Harald Hardrada was utterly destroyed. The new hybridized Anglo-Scandinavian synthesis, represented by the capable King Harold Godwinson, was defeated and slain. And the new, feudalized, Christianized, and ruthlessly organized Viking, William the Conqueror, was victorious. The raw fear of the Viking raider had been superseded by the far more systematic, bureaucratic, and oppressive fear of the new Norman ruling class. William and his followers would impose their own language, their own legal system, their own network of stone castles, symbols of domination that scarred the landscape, and their own rigid feudal order on the English people. To enforce their rule, they unleashed the Harrying of the North, a campaign of such brutal, scorched earth devastation that it left vast swathes of the old Danelaw a depopulated wasteland for a generation. The fear had not ended, it had simply become the state. But what of the original fear? What happened to that potent cultural memory, the ghost of the dragon ship? It receded from the world of politics and warfare into the realm of myth, folklore, and literature. In England, the Viking became the Dane, the shadowy bogeyman in local legends, the imagined builder of ancient ruins and unexplained hilltop earthworks. But it was in the cold, windswept, and isolated landscape of Iceland that the memory of the Viking Age was not just preserved but transformed into one of the great literary traditions of the medieval world. Iceland had been settled in the late 9th and 10th centuries primarily by Norsemen fleeing the centralizing power of kings like Harald Fairhair in Norway. They created a unique society, a republic of chieftains governed by an ancient parliamentary assembly, the Althing. In the relative peace and quiet of their remote island, cut off from the main currents of European change, a remarkable literary culture blossomed. Sometime in the 12th and 13th centuries, long after the events they described had passed into history, anonymous authors began to write down the old stories, the oral histories of the first settlers, the genealogies of the great families, and the heroic tales of the age of raiding, feuding, and exploration. These were the Icelandic sagas. The sagas are a window into the soul of the Viking world. They are written in a spare, laconic, and brutally unsentimental prose style, a style that presents acts of shocking violence and deep emotional turmoil with a cool, objective detachment. They are filled with intricate blood feuds that span generations, with voyages to unknown lands like Greenland and Vinland, with proud, intelligent, and often terrifyingly manipulative women who drive men to their doom, and with warriors who face their preordained fate. They're weird, with a grim, stoic, and sometimes fatalistic courage. In the world of the sagas, the fear that the Vikings inspired in others is turned inward. The stories become a relentless exploration of the internal contradictions of a society built upon a warrior code of honor. The intractable demand for personal honor and the absolute necessity of avenging any slight, no matter how small, locks characters and families into cycles of violence and revenge from which there is no escape. The sagas are not a simple glorification of the Viking Age. They are a profound and often melancholy inquest into it, a detailed and sophisticated meditation on the heroic but ultimately self-destructive nature of the very qualities, the pride, the aggression, the individualism that had made the Northmen so feared by the outside world. The sagas are the Viking world performing its own literary autopsy, trying to understand how its own greatness led to its own tragic demise. This complex, often dark literary memory was largely forgotten by the rest of Europe for centuries. It was the 19th century, with its passion for nationalism, its Gothic sensibilities, and its romantic fascination with the medieval past, that rediscovered the Vikings and remade them in a new and wildly inaccurate image. The dirty, pragmatic, slave-trading Norseman of the historical record was replaced by the noble savage of romantic poetry and art, a symbol of primal freedom and untamed passion. The most famous and enduring visual cliché of this romantic reinvention was the horned helmet. There is not a single shred of archaeological or contemporary textual evidence to suggest that Viking warriors ever wore horned helmets in battle. The image was a fantasy, a piece of theatrical shorthand likely born from the costume designs for Richard Wagner's epic opera cycle, Der Ring des Nibelungen, in the 1870s, which fused Norse and Germanic mythology into a grand spectacle. The horned helmet was a powerful visual symbol of a romanticized, wild, and pagan past, a useful invention for an age seeking its national roots. It captured a new kind of fear, not the historical, existential fear of a real threat, but a thrilling, titillating, and ultimately safe fear, the enjoyable horror of a Gothic novel or a monster movie. Today, the fear of the Vikings is an echo, a reflection in the funhouse mirror of popular culture. We encounter it in television shows that blend historical drama with soap opera, in video games that allow us to inhabit the role of the Viking hero, and in the thunderous chords of heavy metal music that borrows its potent imagery of ice, fire, and steel. The Viking has become a global brand, a multi-purpose symbol of rebellion, exploration, rugged individualism, and a certain kind of aggressive, often hyper-masculine freedom. It is a fear that has been thoroughly tamed, commercialized, commodified, and stripped of its historical terror. In a final, ironic twist, the image has even been co-opted by white supremacist groups who pervert the complex history of the Northmen into a simplistic and hateful ideology of racial purity, a grotesque distortion of a past that was, in reality, defined by movement, mixing, and cultural exchange. To truly understand the original fear, we must listen past the noise of modern caricature and propaganda. We must listen for the profound silence of a ruined monastery on a windswept coast. We must listen for the frantic, whispered Latin of a prayer for deliverance from a fury that seemed to have no end. We must listen for the grinding crunch of a dragon ship's keel on a sandy beach, a sound that for 300 years meant that a world was about to end. For the fear the Vikings inspired was not a myth. It was the lived, terrifying, and world-shaping experience of millions of people. It was a force that shattered kingdoms, redrew maps, forged new nations, and left an indelible scar on the psyche and the very DNA of the Western world. A scar whose faint, intricate outline can still be traced, even now, 1,000 years after the last longship sailed for home and into legend. And so, the longship sails into the mist of history, its dragon-headed prow becoming one with the fog of memory. Its wake, a turbulent churn of blood and silver, of terror and transformation, eventually stills, leaving behind a world irrevocably changed. The journey through the Viking fear is a voyage into the dark heart of an age, a 300-year storm that broke upon the shores of the known world and spared no one. We have traced its path from the first horrified prayer at Lindisfarne, through the systematic conquest of the great heathen army, to the grand, audacious voyages into the sophisticated empires of the Mediterranean and the endless forests of the Rus. We have seen the fear evolve, from the primal terror of the unknown pagan, to the institutionalized dread of the Danegeld, to the complex anxiety of living alongside a conqueror who slowly becomes your neighbor, your kinsman, your king. We have witnessed its final, spectacular death rattle in the mud and blood of 1066, a year when the Viking legacy went to war with itself and consumed its own children, leaving a Norman duke, the most disciplined and forward-looking of its heirs, to inherit the prize. But to say that the fear ended at Hastings or with the baptism of the last Scandinavian king is to misunderstand the nature of fear itself. It does not simply vanish, it seeps into the soil, it becomes part of the bedrock. It echoes. The true legacy of the Viking terror is not found in the chronicles of its battles, but in the enduring and often invisible ways it reshaped the mind, the map, and the very soul of Europe. To fully comprehend this legacy, we must first return to the fear itself, to dissect its anatomy and appreciate its many terrifying textures. It was, at its core, a fear of chaos, a confrontation with what the medieval Christian world perceived as entropy in human form. Theirs was a world built on order, however fragile. It was an order decreed by God, administered by the church, and enforced by a hierarchy of kings, lords, and vassals. It was a world of boundaries, between the sacred and the profane, between the kingdom and the wilderness, between the non-combatant and the warrior. The Viking arrived as a living refutation of all these boundaries. He treated a monastery not as a sacred sanctuary, but as a poorly defended bank vault, a repository of bullion and slaves. He respected no frontier, his shallow draft ship turning every river into a potential beachhead, erasing the distinction between coast and heartland. He obeyed no recognized rules of war, launching surprise attacks in winter, slaying priests at the altar, and seeing every man, woman, and child as a potential commodity. This absolute disregard for the established order was profoundly terrifying. It suggested that the world was not as stable as the monks and kings believed it to be. It hinted that the Christian God's order was a fragile artifice, a thin film of ice over a deep, dark, and violent ocean, and that the Northmen had just punched a hole through it. It was also a fear of the void. The sea, in the medieval imagination, was a place of profound mystery and dread. It was the great, formless expanse at the edge of the world, populated by krakens, sea serpents, and all the monsters of the Mappa Mundi. For the Vikings to emerge from this void, to master it, to use it as a highway, was to align themselves with the terrifying forces of the unknown. They were not just men from another place, they seemed to be men from another reality, beings who were part of the storm, not subject to it. Their ships, with their serpentine prows, did not look like human conveyances. They looked like creatures of the deep that had crawled ashore. This perception, this association with the monstrous and the elemental, amplified the terror they inspired. It was not just an army attacking, it was the sea itself rising up to swallow the land. As the age progressed, this morphed into a more intimate, more corrosive fear, the fear of contamination and hybridity. When the Vikings ceased to be a seasonal raider and became a permanent settler in places like the Danelaw and Normandy, the nature of the threat changed. The external enemy was now an internal presence. The fear was no longer of a clean death by the axe, but of a slow, cultural dissolution. What did it mean to be an Englishman when your lord was a Norse jarl, when the laws were Danish, when the very name of your village was in a foreign tongue? What did it mean to be a Christian when your neighbour still discreetly left offerings for Thor in the sacred grove? Or when the cross in your own church was carved with the writhing forms of pagan beasts locked in a battle from a heathen apocalypse? This was the anxiety of a world losing its clear definitions. The fear was of your children speaking a mixed language, of your daughter being taken as a wife by a Norseman, of your grandchildren having the blood of the conqueror in their veins. It was the fear of your own identity becoming blurred, of looking in the mirror and seeing the features of your enemy slowly emerging on your own face. This process of assimilation, which we now see as a rich cultural exchange, was for many at the time a source of deep and abiding anxiety, a sense that their world was being irrevocably diluted and lost. This deeply personal fear was mirrored at the level of the state by the institutionalization of terror. The Danegeld was the most obvious example. It was fear as public policy. It turned the abstract dread of a raid into a concrete, quantifiable, and recurring financial obligation. It was a national humiliation, a yearly ritual of submission. The act of melting down a church's sacred chalice to pay off a pagan army was a devastating act of spiritual surrender. It communicated to the people that their king's armies could not protect them, and their God's sacred objects could not protect themselves. It created a vicious cycle of appeasement, where weakness was rewarded with further extortion. The Norman castle, the legacy of the domesticated Viking, was another form of institutionalized fear. The stark, intimidating stone keeps that William the Conqueror and his barons erected across the English landscape were not merely defensive structures, they were instruments of psychological domination. They were a permanent, brooding presence on the skyline, a daily, silent declaration of who was master. The fear was no longer a chaotic force of nature. It had become an organized system of oppression, built of stone and mortar and enforced by the armored knight. From this crucible of multi-layered fear, a new Europe was forged. The political consequences were monumental. The modern nation of England, for example, is a direct product of the Viking threat. Before the Northmen arrived, England was a geographical expression, a patchwork of rival Anglo-Saxon kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex. It was the existential threat posed by the great heathen army that shattered the old kingdoms and forced the lone survivor, Wessex, under Alfred the Great and his successors, to innovate and unify. The nationwide system of burghs, the national militia, the creation of a navy, the very idea of a single English king ruling over a single English people, all these were forged in direct response to the Viking terror. Without the Vikings, the unification of England might have taken centuries longer, or it might never have happened at all. Similarly, the foundation of the Duchy of Normandy was an act of fearful pragmatism by a Frankish king, an attempt to use the Viking threat to contain itself. This act created a dynamic and aggressive new power that would not only conquer England, but would also establish kingdoms in Sicily and southern Italy and play a pivotal role in the Crusades. In the east, the Ruses, traders and slavers, the terror of the Slavic tribes, organized the peoples of the forest into a state, Kievan Ruses, the political and cultural ancestor of three modern nations. The Vikings, in their quest for plunder and power, inadvertently acted as a violent, brutal catalyst for state formation across the continent. They were the aggressive irritant that forced the European oyster to produce the pearl of the centralized nation-state. The linguistic legacy of this fear is, perhaps, its most intimate and enduring trace. The sound of our own voices is an echo of this violent past. Old English, the language of the Anglo-Saxons, was a robust and complex Germanic language. When the Danish Vikings settled the Danelaw, their language, Old Norse, was forced into a prolonged and intense period of contact with it. The two languages were related, but distinct. A Dane and an Englishman could probably make themselves understood, but it would be a struggle. In the crucible of the Danelaw, a new, simplified and hybrid language began to form. The complex grammatical endings of Old English were worn away, smoothed down by the constant friction of everyday communication. The syntax became more streamlined, more reliant on word order than on case endings. But more importantly, Old Norse injected a vast and powerful dose of new vocabulary directly into the heart of English. These were not fancy literary words, but the hard, practical, everyday words of life, law, and conflict. The modern English word law itself is a direct borrowing from Old Norse lag. The word husband comes from husbondi, meaning house dweller. The fundamental verb to take replaced the Old English nieman. Even the basic pronouns of modern English, they, them, and their, are Scandinavian imports, which gradually replaced their Old English equivalents because they were less ambiguous. The list is almost endless, a ghostly testament to the Norse presence in every aspect of life. Words of violence and anger, awe, die, hit, slaughter, ransack, wrong. Words of the body and the natural world, birth, bull, dirt, drag, egg, freckle, guest, leg, root, scale, skin, sky, wing. Words of society and commerce, axle, band, bank, booth, bylaw, fellow, get, gift, ill, kid, link, loan, low, odd, raise, sail, skill, snare, sprint, thrive, trust, want. The very texture of the English language, its directness, its practicality, its vast and flexible vocabulary, is a product of this violent, fearful, but ultimately fertile collision of cultures. The fear of the Viking is embedded in the grammar we use to think, the words we use to speak. It is a ghost in the machine of our language, and the fear left its mark in the blood. Modern genetic studies, with their ability to trace ancient patterns of migration, have confirmed the sheer scale of the Scandinavian settlement. DNA analysis of populations in the north and east of England, in the heart of the old Danelaw, shows a significant and lasting contribution from Scandinavian ancestors. Similar patterns are found in Scotland, the Orkney and Shetland Islands, which were essentially Norse colonies for centuries. Ireland, particularly around the cities the Vikings founded, like Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick, and of course Normandy in France. The Viking was not just a temporary raider, he was a settler, an immigrant, and an ancestor. The genetic map of Northern Europe is a palimpsest, with the traces of the Viking migrations written over older layers of Celtic, Germanic, and Roman DNA. The fear of the other ended, in many cases, with the other becoming a part of us in the most literal, biological sense. When the age of raiding finally ended, what became of the immense, violent energy of the Viking spirit? It did not simply disappear, it was sublimated, transformed, and channeled into new forms. The raw aggression of the berserker was disciplined into the charge of the Norman knight. The wanderlust of the explorer was redirected into the religious fervor of the crusade, and the oral traditions of the pagan skald were painstakingly written down and transformed into the great prose epics of Iceland. It is here, in the Icelandic sagas, that we find the most profound and self-aware reflection on the nature of the Viking fear. Written in the 13th and 14th centuries, long after the heroic age had passed, the sagas are an attempt by a literate Christian society to understand its own violent pagan past. The world of the sagas is a world governed by an unforgiving code of honor and a relentless logic of blood feud. Figures like Egil Skallagrimsson, the warrior poet who is by turns a brilliant artist, a loyal friend, a greedy raider, and a savage killer, embody the deep contradictions of the Viking character. Or Njal Thorgeirsson from the masterpiece Njal's Saga, a man of peace and law who is nonetheless destroyed by a catastrophic feud that he is powerless to stop, a feud that culminates in his entire family being burned alive in their own farmhouse. The sagas present a world where the very qualities that made the Vikings fearsome to outsiders, their fierce independence, their obsession with reputation, their readiness to resort to violence, inevitably turn inward, consuming their own society in a self-perpetuating cycle of vengeance. The fear in the sagas is not the fear of the Viking, it is the fear of being a Viking. It is the tragic recognition that the heroic code, when followed to its logical conclusion, leads only to death and ruin. The sagas are the Viking world's eulogy for itself, a melancholy and deeply intelligent literary monument built over the grave of its own terrifying past. For centuries, this complex historical Viking lay buried, forgotten by all but a few scholars. The rediscovery and reinvention of the Viking in the 19th century created a new kind of myth and a new kind of fear. This was not a real fear, but a romantic one, the thrilling frisson of the Gothic. The Viking became a symbol of primitive power, of untamed nature, of a noble savagery that stood in stark contrast to the perceived stuffiness and industrial grime of the modern world. He was given a horned helmet, a flowing beard, and a lust for life and freedom. This romantic image, a fantasy woven from nationalism and nostalgia, has proven to be incredibly durable. It is this image, not the historical reality, that powers the vast global industry of Viking-themed entertainment today. In television shows, films, and video games, we are invited to identify with the Viking, to experience a sanitized and consequence-free version of his life of adventure and combat. The fear has been transformed into a power fantasy. We are no longer the terrified monk cowering in the chapel. We are the axe-wielding hero, the master of our own destiny. This modern myth, for all its commercial success, casts a long and sometimes dangerous shadow. In its most perverse form, this romanticized image of a pure, strong, and racially distinct warrior people has been co-opted by white supremacist and neo-pagan extremist groups across the world. They distort the complex, multicultural, and migratory history of the Northmen into a hateful and static ideology of blood and soil. They turn the Viking from a historical figure into a symbol of racial purity, ignoring the fact that the Viking world was a melting pot of Scandinavian, Slavic, Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and even Arab influences. This misappropriation is the final, ghoulish afterlife of the Viking fear. The terror that once came from outside, from the sea, has been twisted into an internal poison, a fear of the other that is projected onto a fantasized, pure, and homogeneous past. It is a betrayal of the true historical legacy of the Viking Age, which was a story of constant movement, violent contact, and profound, world-changing fusion. And so, we are left with the echoes. The fear of the Vikings is gone, but its consequences are woven into the fabric of our world, into the borders of our nations, the words on our tongues, the genes in our cells, and the myths in our imagination. The story of the Viking terror is not, in the end, a simple story of good versus evil, of civilized versus barbarian. It is a far more complex and unsettling story about the brutal, creative, and transformative power of fear itself. It teaches us that societies, when faced with an existential threat, do not simply endure, they are forced to change. They innovate, they organize, they unify, they build walls, and sometimes they commit atrocities. They are broken down and then reforged into something new, something stronger, and often something harder. The Viking held up a dark mirror to the societies of early medieval Europe, and the reflection that stared back forced them to become what they are. The fury of the Northmen has long since passed. The dragon ships are dust, but the world they made, a world born from their terror, is the world we still inhabit today. Thank you for lending us a moment of your time, for joining us on this long journey back into the heart of a great and terrible darkness. It is in confronting such profound moments of fear, in understanding their origins and their legacies, that we can perhaps begin to better understand the echoes of fear in our own time and the world it might be shaping, even now, while we are not watching.